There comes a moment in every thinking person's life, a quiet yet profound pause, where the inner voice, so long buried beneath layers of social obligations, expectations, and false politeness, begins to whisper the most unsettling question of all: who am I really when I am not trying to please anyone? And it is in this question, so simple on the surface yet unfathomably deep in its implications, that Carl Jung's warning begins to take root. For he saw clearly what many of us spend a lifetime avoiding: that the compulsion to be liked, to be agreeable, to mold oneself endlessly to the contours of other people's comfort, is not a virtue but a psychological disease, a silent self-erasure disguised as kindness. In a world that rewards conformity and penalizes defiance in subtle but brutal ways, we are taught from an early age that it is safer to please than to protest, safer to say yes with a clenched jaw than to say no with an honest heart, and safer to be acceptable than to be authentic. And yet, this safety is an illusion, a cleverly disguised trap that leads not to belonging, but to an ever-tightening spiral of inner fragmentation and loss of self-respect. Jung, who spent his life studying the architecture of the psyche, recognized that the individual who sacrifices their inner truth for outer harmony is not evolving, but regressing, not growing, but collapsing inward under the unbearable weight of an inauthentic existence. To understand this dynamic more deeply, we must examine what Jung referred to as the persona, the social mask each of us wears to navigate the complex web of human interaction and identity, not born of our souls longing, but rather constructed from the expectations, judgments, and unconscious needs of those around us. While the persona is not inherently evil, in fact, it is necessary for social functioning and communication. It becomes dangerous when we begin to believe it is who we truly are. And in the lives of chronic people pleasers, this mask fuses with the self so thoroughly that the original face behind it is all but forgotten. People-pleasing, therefore, is not a mere habit or behavioral quirk. It is a psychological defense mechanism born from a profound existential fear: the fear of rejection, the terror of isolation, the belief that love and respect are contingent upon our ability to suppress our needs and amplify the desires of others. At its core, people-pleasing is an unconscious agreement we make with the world. I will diminish myself so that you may feel comfortable, and in return, I ask only that you don't abandon me. But this agreement, while seemingly noble, is built upon sand, and sooner or later, the waves of resentment, exhaustion, and silent rage wash it away. Jung would argue that such a life defined by compulsive external validation and internal suppression prevents the process he called individuation, the psychological journey toward wholeness, in which the conscious self must integrate the unconscious, including those rejected and uncomfortable parts we've been conditioned to hide. And herein lies the crux of the matter. The people-pleaser cannot individuate, cannot truly mature or become whole, because they are too busy curating a false image of themselves for others to consume, a spiritual puppet performing for applause in a theater of insecurity. The tragedy is that people-pleasers often believe they are doing good. They pride themselves on their helpfulness, their agreeableness, their reliability, and yet this goodness is not born of strength, but of fear. It is not rooted in genuine love, but in the avoidance of conflict. And what is worse, this behavior often breeds the very disrespect they hope to avoid. Because when you train others to believe that your boundaries are negotiable, your needs irrelevant, and your time disposable, they begin to see you not as a whole person worthy of respect, but as a convenient function to serve their needs. The paradox then is this: the more you abandon yourself to please others, the less they actually respect you. And the more you try to win love through obedience, the more invisible you become, not only to others but to yourself. Jung understood that true respect begins with the courage to disappoint, to displease, even to provoke discomfort, not out of cruelty or ego, but out of a deep allegiance to one's own integrity. You cannot teach others to value your truth if you are constantly hiding it. You cannot demand boundaries if you are unwilling to enforce them. You cannot be respected if you do not respect yourself first. And self-respect, Jung would say, begins the moment you stop betraying your soul to preserve someone else's comfort. But this is not easy, and no one should pretend it is. To stop pleasing others is to unlearn decades of programming, to confront the psychological wounds that taught you your worth is conditional, and to enter into a period of painful but necessary self-confrontation. You will feel guilt, as though you are doing something wrong. You will feel fear, as though every boundary you set might lead to rejection or loneliness. You will feel grief, as the relationships built on your compliance begin to fall away. And yet, this is the fire through which the true self is forged. For there is no authenticity without sacrifice, no individuation without struggle, and no self-respect without the willingness to be disliked. The challenge, Jung would say, is not to eradicate the persona entirely, but to disidentify from it, to stop mistaking the mask for the face beneath it, to use the persona when necessary, but never to allow it to govern your identity. In practical terms, this means learning to say no without explanation, to express your needs without apology, to endure the silence that follows a truth that others don't want to hear. It means becoming comfortable with the discomfort of not being liked, and seeing that discomfort not as a failure, but as a sign that you are finally becoming real. It also means learning to embrace the shadow, that dark, neglected corner of your psyche that contains all the feelings, impulses, and truths you were taught to repress. People-pleasing often arises from a refusal to face the shadow, from the fear that if we were to express our anger, our needs, our dissatisfaction, we would be abandoned, punished, or shamed. But Jung reminds us that what we repress does not disappear, it becomes stronger, lurking beneath the surface, influencing our behavior in ways we do not understand. Only by turning toward the shadow, by facing the uncomfortable truths about ourselves, can we reclaim the power we have given away. If you want to be respected, then you must be willing to risk being misunderstood. If you want to be respected, you must be prepared to walk alone rather than follow the crowd into falsehood. If you want to be respected, you must understand that love which demands your silence is not love, and harmony that requires your self-erasure is not peace. Respect begins the moment you decide that your authenticity is more important than approval, and your inner truth is more sacred than someone else's comfort. You must begin, today, to observe where you say yes when your body contracts, in protest, where you offer your time or energy while silently screaming for rest, where you withhold your opinions or needs out of fear that someone will think less of you. These are not acts of humility, they are acts of self-betrayal. And every act of self-betrayal is a message to the unconscious. My truth is not important. My boundaries do not matter. Myself is not worth protecting. The psyche cannot endure this message forever without breaking. You may believe that others will not like the real you, that they will reject your truth, your boundaries, your anger, your complexity, and perhaps some will. But that is the necessary filter through which real respect is born. For the people who remain, who respect your truth even when it is inconvenient, who honor your boundaries even when they are not beneficial to them, those are the people with whom true connection is possible. And until you stop performing for applause, you will never know who they are. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That privilege is not won through pleasing, but through truth-telling. Not through compliance, but through courage. If you want to be respected, you must stop pleasing others, not because it is selfish, but because it is the first act of becoming real. You cannot teach the world to respect you while you continue to abandon yourself. You cannot find freedom while you are still enslaved to everyone else's comfort. So begin today, not with grand declarations, but with small acts of honesty. A boundary clearly stated, a no courageously spoken, a need unapologetically expressed. These are the building blocks of self-respect, the quiet but powerful revolutions through which your soul reclaims its voice. And as that voice grows stronger, as the persona begins to loosen and the shadow is no longer feared but integrated, you will discover that respect, true, deep, unshakable respect, begins not from others, but from within. You do not need to earn it through sacrifice. You only need to stop giving yourself away. And once you have begun to reclaim your voice, once you have allowed yourself the terrifying freedom of not being who others expect you to be, you will begin to notice a strange and beautiful transformation, first subtle, then impossible to ignore. As your body begins to unclench, your mind begins to clear, and your soul, so long silenced under layers of imposed politeness and unspoken resentment, begins to whisper again, not the voices of others, but your own, an unfamiliar yet ancient rhythm, the language of your true self awakening from the long sleep of compliance. At first, this will feel like loss, and you must be brave enough to mourn it, mourn the friendships that were built on your silence, mourn the admiration that was rooted in your self-erasure, mourn the approval that came at the cost of your authenticity. Because shedding the persona is not just an act of courage, it is an act of grief. For it means letting go of the identity you once believed was necessary for love, for belonging, for safety, and replacing it with something less certain, but infinitely more alive, your truth. And your truth, when first spoken after years of repression, may not sound graceful or eloquent or tidy. It may come out in fragments and stutters, in moments of awkward defiance and trembling resolve. But this is not a sign of weakness. It is the sound of rebirth, of muscles long unused stretching toward movement, of a voice long buried beneath expectations finding its way to the surface, not to entertain, not to convince, but simply to exist. there is something deeply unsettling, yet profoundly liberating, about realizing that the respect you so desperately sought from others is something they could never truly give you, not because they are incapable, but because it was never theirs to bestow. It was always yours to claim, not by meeting their expectations, but by refusing to abandon your own. Jung would say that individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole, integrated person, is not a path of addition, but of subtraction. It is not about becoming more agreeable, more likable, more polished, but about stripping away everything that is false, everything that was adopted out of fear, everything that served a role but never resonated with your essence, until what remains is not the echo of others' desires, but the clear, resonant tone of your own being. And this process, painful as it is, opens the door to a different kind of life, not one devoid of relationships, but one rooted in authenticity, where connections are forged not through performance but through presence, where love is not earned through obedience but offered freely, to the self that no longer begs for permission to exist. For respect, in its deepest form, is not a reward others give you when you behave correctly. It is the natural response they feel when they encounter someone who no longer needs their validation, someone who stands rooted in the soil of their own soul, unshaken by disapproval, unmoved by manipulation, unafraid of solitude. And yes, there will be solitude, real solitude, not just the absence of company, but the sacred silence that descends when you stop filling every space with apologies, explanations, and the relentless effort to be understood. And in that silence, you will face everything you once fled: your unmet needs, your unshed tears, your suppressed rage, your quiet longing. But do not run, for it is in this silence that the self begins to crystallize. And once you have passed through this crucible, once you have felt the sting of disapproval and survived, once you have faced your own shadow and found that it did not destroy you, but empowered you, you will begin to feel something that no amount of praise, applause, or external approval could ever give: a deep, unshakable dignity, born not from what others think of you, but from what you know about yourself. You will know that you are no longer the one who says yes while screaming no inside, no longer the one who betrays their own needs to avoid a frown or a raised eyebrow, no longer the one who pretends to be okay just to maintain the illusion of harmony. You will be the one who tells the truth, who walks away when needed, who chooses peace not by keeping everyone happy, but by staying loyal to your own inner compass. And this, Jung would say, is the return to the self, the center of your being that exists beyond roles, beyond masks, beyond the fragmented performances of the ego. This is where your wholeness resides, not in being liked, but in being real, not in avoiding conflict, but in embracing integrity, not in pleasing others, but in honoring the soul that can no longer be silenced without cost. You will discover, perhaps for the first time, that respect flows not from the approval of the crowd, but from the alignment of your life with your deepest truth, and that those who truly see you, who truly value you, will not be repelled by your authenticity, but drawn to it not because you please them, but because you remind them of the courage they have not yet claimed. And so the journey continues, not toward perfection, but toward integration, not toward performance, but toward presence. And each step, though difficult, will reinforce a truth that was always waiting beneath the surface, that the more you become yourself, the more the world will mirror back to you not just respect, but reverence, not for the mask you wore, but for the soul you dared to reveal. And if that means walking alone for a while, so be it. Better to walk alone in truth than to be surrounded in falsehood. Better to be respected in solitude than to be loved in servitude. And better to be whole and real and free than to be liked but lost. Because in the end, the only approval that matters, the only respect that endures, is the kind that arises when you look in the mirror and see not a mask, not a role, not a sacrifice, but a self reclaimed. And that, Carl Jung would remind us, is the beginning of everything. And once you reach the point where the reflection in the mirror no longer feels like a performance, when your words and your silence both arise from the same place of inner alignment, you will begin to understand something that cannot be taught, only lived through. Respect, in its truest form, is not a transaction, not something you barter for with endless favors and suppressed opinions, but a natural result of inner congruence, of becoming so inwardly integrated that the external world can no longer distort your sense of worth, because you no longer derive your identity from its fleeting reactions. This kind of respect is quiet. It doesn't parade itself, doesn't need applause, doesn't tremble at criticism, because it is born not from dominance or control, but from the radical act of no longer lying to yourself, no longer pretending to be less than you are, no longer fearing that your truth will break what is meant to stay. For when you live from the core of your being, even your rejections become acts of grace. Even your boundaries become offerings of love. because they come from a place that is not trying to hurt others, but trying, finally, to stop hurting yourself. And what many do not understand, until they arrive at this juncture themselves, is that the compulsion to please is not just about being nice or polite. It is a defense, a strategy, an unconscious effort to avoid abandonment, to control how others feel about us, to manage the unbearable anxiety that arises when we are disliked. And yet this control is an illusion. For the more you try to bend yourself to fit someone else's mold, the more you lose the ability to shape your own destiny. Carl Jung warned us that whatever we fail to bring to consciousness will appear in our lives as fate and people-pleasing. Unchecked and unexamined becomes one of those fates we unconsciously manifest, a life that looks good on the outside but feels hollow within. A set of relationships built on your silence rather than your truth. A sense of identity so fragmented that you begin to wonder whether you ever truly existed, outside of what others needed from you. And so, the great and difficult work begins, the work of turning inward not with judgment but with compassion, of examining the moments when you abandon yourself for approval not as failures, but as survival strategies that no longer serve you, of peeling back the layers of your persona not to destroy what you've built, but to see what parts of you are still waiting, patiently, to be welcomed home. This work does not happen all at once. It happens in moments, small but significant, like when you say no for the first time and don't rush to explain why, like when you express a boundary and resist the urge to soften it with apology, like when you allow someone to be disappointed in you without letting their discomfort rewrite your truth. And in these moments, you begin to rewire not just your behavior, but your entire nervous system, teaching yourself slowly, gently, consistently that you do not need to earn safety by erasing yourself. That love is not something to be bought with compliance, and that respect begins the moment you stop negotiating your worth. And as you deepen into this work, you begin to see your shadow not as the enemy, not as something to suppress or deny, but as the guardian of your power. Those parts of you that once seemed dangerous, or ugly, or selfish to be loved now reveal themselves as necessary pieces of your wholeness. Your anger, your grief, your hunger to be seen, your need to rest, your right to speak, all of them aspects of your soul that were never meant to be sacrificed for the comfort of others.